Welcome to Retailistic, the official podcast of Coresight Research for October 7th, 2025. This week, Coresight Research President Max Kahn sits down with serial entrepreneur and cybersecurity expert Josh Horwitz to discuss the future of online security.
This is Max Kahn, president of Coresight Research, and I'm so pleased to have Joshua Horwitz with me. Josh is a serial entrepreneur who most recently was the COO and co-founder of Enzoic, which is a cybersecurity company. Before that, he was the president and founder of Bolger Logic, and we're very excited to have him here today. Josh, welcome.
Thanks, Max. Happy to be here.
And if you don't mind, Josh, just tell us, I know you've been sort of a serial entrepreneur. Tell us a little bit about your, sort of your background and, what kind of prompted you to go off into the founder world and, and stick with it with a couple of successful exits.
So, Max, my background after finishing my MBA went to work for IBM, big company, of course, and sort of felt a calling to be in a smaller company and had always a focus on entrepreneurship. At IBM, I was already sort of starting to think about various ideas and went on to work with some other companies, but I had in the back of my mind an idea around a customer advocacy. So in an enterprise sales process, how do you get your customers to be kind of, support the sales, speak to prospects, give testimonials and case studies, things that were pretty important to the enterprise sales process. And that was really the first idea that I had, and that started and ran that business for well over a decade. And then ended up selling it to one of my competitors. I took a little time off after that and connected with a really strong technology co-founder who already had a nascent idea in the cybersecurity space. I had a little bit of my own experience working in the anti-malware space myself. And so sort of played off of that to partner with him and develop what became Zoic, and worked for that for 6 years and recently exited from that. And yeah, both of those businesses were bootstrapped. I really like the sort of the early stage of business, helping to find a new market and figure out how to get that product market fit. And it's been a fun ride.
Yeah, so Josh, we're going to I definitely want to look forward to hearing more about the cybersecurity experience that you had with Enzoic. But before we get to that, let's talk maybe a little bit about sort of that founder. There was kind of two things that you talked about that I think people would love to hear more about. First would be bootstrapping, right? If I remember correctly, I don't think you raised money for either company. Secondly, and we'll get to this in a bit as well, is the the idea of sort of product to market fit, because I think that's always a tricky thing for entrepreneurs. I think a lot of entrepreneurs have a great idea, right? And they think they've come up with, with some really cool technology or a cool idea, but they don't always think about that, whether it actually fits with what the market requires, versus just thinking about it as being a good idea. So maybe that's actually not a bad springboard. Tell me a little bit more about how you kind of, worked through that product market fit to really make sure that, you had something that people were going to be willing to, to purchase from you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, bootstrapping side of it is a little bit of a DNA that's just sort of, I feel just much more comfortable making sure that I have something that really works. And before I go out and try to put a lot of gas on the fire, and I've been fortunate where I've been able to create products and businesses where, growth has been generated sufficient for the size of the market. Yeah, I probably could, have gone out and gotten some more gas to do it a little differently, but some of that's just a little bit on me and the style I like to approach it. I think the product market fit is super important aspect of that, because it's I see too often entrepreneurs who have that idea, like you said, that they're super excited about, and if they're raising money too quickly, it's a they get kind of ahead of the cart a little bit, and are anxious to build it all out and then sort of see how the customer likes it. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And what I've found is there's a tremendous amount that you can do to really validate what your offering is through fairly low cost methods of testing the market. And that's everything from collecting surveys or doing things, putting sort of pieces out into the marketplace that determine whether there's uptake and interest in it. Really low cost things you can do. You can literally put Google Ads against a white paper or something that you might have written and see kind of what the interest is for it, and evolve that to other techniques where you're able to see what kind of attention and uptake it draws. And then, of course, talking with customers. And there's just a ton that you can do with really making sure that the product resonates and adapting it based on the feedback that you had. Boulder Logic has relatively, it was a fortunate one that kind of hit the mark based on what our sort of initial concept was, without too much modification to it. The second business in cybersecurity required some evolution, and it's tough, particularly if you're in a sort of a more engineering centric organization. So particularly if it's started with a strong tech founder, to focus on, let's get this thing built. But to me, I want to know that it's going to be bought and not just built. And so testing that is, I think, a really important piece.
What was a good sort of story in the field where you had an aha moment that, that you had something, you know what I mean? Like some sort of validation, either from a customer or a survey, any good anecdotes in terms of one of your discoveries from either company?
Well, so in the first business, it was still, early stages of Google, and relatively easy to get SEO ranking for a fairly specific concept. And so I was able to get some of that message out there without even paying for the Google ads. And I had inbound phone calls, frankly, that customers were looking for exactly what was listed there. So it doesn't get much easier than that. And it
A little
was
easier than normal, I will say,
it's a
right?
little bit easier than normal. But, I still, push back to say, well, let's really talk about what your goals are and, the problem that you're trying to solve. And so there was, it's easy for potential customers to say, yeah, that's what I want. But I think the important piece is to really, try to understand kind of, how deep that need is. Is the pain acute enough that they're willing to pay for it, and so forth. So, that one was a little bit easier. On the cybersecurity side, we had some assumptions about how the buyer would use the technology that we built, and they, in that case, assumed relatively low effort from their developers to consume an API-based service. And really what we found, and there were other products that were trying to do it that way, but what we found in more detailed conversations was that in theory that worked, but it was just going to be too much effort for the organization to secure really their own developers to consume an API. So we had to kind of rejigger the product and the approach to make it something that would be a much more push button based approach. And I think that's one of the challenges. You've got your cybersecurity department, and then you've got the development side of the organization, and getting access to internal development was much more difficult than that we might have expected. That was one piece of it. And like I said, we did other things like putting out, I mentioned, white papers and advertisements to try to gauge interest, and run sort of some benchmarking surveys and other things to understand how they were addressing problems in the area. And it's a lot of work, and it's not necessarily sort of the sexy side of, let's build a product and get it to market, but it kind of really lays the foundation to building something that actually is going to be, that the customer's really going to actually pay for.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more, maybe switching gears just in terms of Anzoic and the cybersecurity market. So obviously cybersecurity, there's a broad range of applications, whether it be, but my understanding is with Enzoic, you guys were much more focused on, logging credentials for, a user as opposed to, security around, let's say databases and virtual machines and things like that. Is that right? And if, maybe tell us a little bit about the product.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was a very simple product. Was part of what I liked about it. It looked at one of the primary attack vectors, which at the time was credential stuffing. People, it focused on. So first of all, I guess I should just briefly explain what credential stuffing is. So hackers are able to look at past data breaches, and we all know there's tons of them, and be able to see the username and password that individual users have used. And what is very evident when you start to actually look at large data in that area is the concept of a password, which theoretically has millions of permutations, actually doesn't work out that way in reality. The users tend to choose the same passwords again and again. Not only the same passwords for their own individual accounts, so reuse of this bank account and this brokerage account, but also across users. It's just the patterns that they follow are super predictable. And that has to do with the fact that people are trying to have a memorable password. And it's really hard to remember a complex string of characters, particularly if what you're trying to do is have different ones across each of the services, which is really the best practice. It just happens to be that people don't actually do that. So what attackers were doing were looking at past data breaches, and didn't matter whether the data breach was a retail site or a banking site or a healthcare site. Once they had access to passwords and usernames, they were able to do credential stuffing and say, there's a high probability that this person banks with maybe one of the top 5 banks, and be able to try those username and password combinations. And more often than not, they work. So what we did was turn that attack play into a defensive play and help the organization to restrict basically the user to not use the same passwords that they had used on other sites, or even commonly used passwords across other users. And really what that did was sort of force more complexity into the password creation process. Encourage passphrases where a password might just be a long string of words, and that might make it easier for the user to remember, but it's kind of break that pattern. And so while you might be used to seeing a password creation screen say, oh, don't have enough characters there, or you didn't have an uppercase and a lowercase, this would be, we've seen you use, or we've seen others use this password too often, please choose something else. And that did a considerable amount to block the concept of dictionary attacks and credential stuffing attacks.
So no more password 123 explanation.
Exactly. That's top of the list. You got it.
I know that, which is one of the most shocking things in the world, that was, 10 years ago was still so, was common across so many people, right? Which I would imagine it's not anymore. You'd be
People
surprised.
like they assume that it's the company's responsibility for keeping their site secure.
Yeah.
And they may not think about the implications that, this person's going to only be able to get into whether it's my retail account or for a given site. They may not realize that there's consequences to them both on that site and
Right.
others. So it's
Sure.
important for the vendor to make sure that they prevent that from happening.
Yeah. Well, Josh, when you and I were talking before, we were mentioning how, there's a logical trade-off between, complexity of logging in, which is more secure, but discourages people then to use your website, right? So that, that's a difficult balance. And if you think about the idea that if passwords need to get more and more complex, and that is sort of and we talk a lot about it at Coresight, the idea that, you want to make it like basically paint by numbers for the client to be able to use your product, right? And logging in is in some ways is a part of that. So you're starting to see new ways, right, that of people logging in, right? Password lists, biometrics, things like that. I mean, And, I know we're somewhat in early days of that, but at the same time, though, you're starting to see it in more and more places, and, just in just kind of everyday life, even, where do you see, where are we heading with that, in sort of like the passwords and requirement and sophistication of passwords versus biometrics versus passwordless, types solutions. I mean, where's all that heading?
So, I mean, one of the things that has kept passwords very sticky and hard to kind of completely kill is they're pretty basic. They don't require a particular technology. They're not, hard to use. They can be shared in the cases where sharing is, important. There's cases where it's okay to have multiple people log into the same account to a degree. And so those things have kept passwords around for a very long time. I think but just the extent of the problem has really forced the industry to push towards these newer technologies. There's a whole bunch of them from different types of adaptive security that looks at different signals to try to determine how likely is it that this user is who they say they are, to places where they force multi-factor. It actually becomes a requirement. So you can't just use your password. You have to use that token or the code that gets sent to your phone or something like that. And you're right, the trade-off for an organization that's trying to balance convenience for their users with enough friction to keep the bad guys out, but not so much friction that it causes the user defect or to walk away from the transaction. So there's some really nice technologies that are coming relatively quickly at this point. Passkeys you may have seen pop up more and more, and that's a really nice one because it really just takes the user out of the equation. It still gives the concept of a secure kind of secret between between the company and the client, but kind of takes a user-generated password, which is the biggest vulnerability, out of the equation and uses an encryption-based handshake to allow it. So I think the FIDO Association is saying something around 75% of large retailers are moving actively towards passkeys. There's still going to be limits, like I was saying before, where it is somewhat platform dependent, and different browsers, different devices, different versions of devices may or may not support them as completely. So you're still going to have sort of this long tail of alternate login methods, but strong advice to organizations to move away from the password towards some of these, really taking the user out of the equation, and that's really the goal.
So is that basically does that then increase the reliance on biometrics, or is there other, just for people that aren't maybe as familiar with the passkey concept, right? Is it all driven by biometrics, or are there other ways that sort of non-password generated verification can occur?
So the passkeys tend to rely on the biometrics. Basically, what's happening is the secret is established between a device and the server, and so that's an encryption, public key, private key type of exchange to allow that, and it relies then on the user's device to do the basic authentication, and so that would be the biometrics. But
Right.
And so they kind of go hand in hand. There's other ways of getting the initial authentication to happen on the device, but it puts much more trust between the device, the ability to properly log into the device, and then gives the company the trust that they actually have that authorization to allow that person to access the service.
Is there any reluctance? I mean, I know for some people they're totally fine with that, but what level of reluctance is there to biometrics? You know what I mean, as a method for that? I know no one gets into their iPhone, with through their through the face recognition. There still are some holdouts out there.
Yeah, there are. And so that was kind of, where organizations need to have, a flexible, it would be great if there was just, one authentication method for everybody. That would make it a lot simpler for companies. But like I said, the folks that are holdouts or on older technology that might not buy into that or can't use it for some reason, and some disability or other things to prevent that from working. I know that my mother-in-law, for some reason, I don't think she even has the face recognition set up, so she's still using thumbprint, and she was a chef, so her fingerprints are kind of gone away, so that doesn't work reliably. So yeah, there's cases where it can't work, but I think the device-based, the native biometrics is solid. It's taken a little bit for that to get kind of established at the norm. There's other systems and places where biometrics, if it's actually held at the company level rather than locally to the device, that introduces a whole nother list of security vulnerabilities, because at that point, a data breach risks a bad actor getting access to all of that biometric data. And unlike a password, which you can always reset and change to something completely different, I can't really change this face or my fingerprints. It's, that's kind of a more vulnerable piece of identity.
Are there other, as things are getting more sophisticated, are there alternatives to the biometrics, that get you out of the password game? Or is that kind of the only game in town right now?
There's all kinds of different flavors of biometrics and new things that you'll see in terms of retina identification and obviously the facial recognition and thumbprint, voice recognition in some cases is there. I think the three sort of core elements of authentication are what you have. So that would be the device, what you know, that might be the secret or other identifying information that and what you are, and that's the biometrics. So all of them tend to fall into kind of one or more of those buckets. And so, you can see in more secure environments, just your phone is not sufficient. There needs to be a token that goes alongside of it. But the bottom line is, having multiple layers and figuring out how to impose that friction of multiple layers in a way that's as convenient as possible. And that's where another concept of adaptive authentication or adaptive security comes into play, where I may only trigger that token based, where it's going to send a code to your phone if you're logging in a way that is different than we've normally seen. All of a sudden, you're logging in from a different geography in a different time zone, or things don't match up quite right, where you can step up the level of security based on the information you have. And I think that's where more and more data about users and potentially AI comes into play, where they can kind of detect this is a normal pattern, this is an abnormal pattern, rather than maybe strict rules based of ways of determining, is this a login event that we should be more concerned about or less concerned about, and applying the right amount of friction to match the situation.
Similar to how, and part of what you said, similar to how your credit card company might ping you when you're, use your card for the first time on vacation in a place you've never been before type thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Just bring it full circle in a sense. The interesting thing about what you guys were doing in Zempic and other companies that sort of like, you're a B2B sale, but then introducing a B2C, in other words, a technology that's then used by the end customer. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you have to get the business to buy from you, but the business has to be comfortable that their B2C customers, right, are going to embrace or not find it to be an extra impediment to use in the customer journey that they're building for their B2C customers. So I would imagine that introduces an extra wrinkle in terms of that validation relative to the matching the product to the market need. How do you think about trying to get the both getting the business that you're selling to on board, and also understanding that their end customers are going to be happy with the technology as well?
Yeah, well, there's a few different parts of that. So I think that ultimately, for the most part, the organization, our customer, should and does understand their own end users, and kind of what level they can choose, their own sort of level of friction that they're willing to apply. And so that just means, if we're selling to a financial services company, they may have a different attitude about it than a retailer. And a retailer may, be willing to endure a certain amount of loss, fraud or otherwise, that is going to avoid defection of their customers. There's some interesting scenarios where that is then there's different opinions within the organization. So the fraud team may have a different perspective than the product management team, than the than
the
a
marketing.
marketing team, et cetera. And so from a cybersecurity vendor perspective, it's a little bit about kind of understanding as quickly as possible, who you're talking to, who are the key players, what are their concerns, what is the, what type of friction they're willing to endure. And then potentially adapting the product to that. So, and so coming out of the gates, we took a very strict-based approach that I think the cybersecurity team, the fraud team, would have felt was really an effective fraud prevention. But we quickly learned that product or marketing may have different motivations and objectives, and so adjusting both messaging as well as the way the product worked to address that. And I think that kind of it goes back to trying to really understand who you're going to sell at early in the development of the company.
How much did you find that you needed to get your customer comfortable with how their customer was going to feel about using the technology?
Yeah, there's a little bit of client therapy that was in that process to help them understand that. But some of it, it was there were sort of fairly strong opinions that weren't always entirely rational, but were things that we couldn't sort of educate them out of. Concerns that it was just going to be too hard for them to come up with a password if we didn't let them use the exact same password that everyone else was using, or that they had used that we knew that was breached on another site. And for an over reliance in their mind on multi-factor authentication, meaning assuming that a second layer was going to be solving the problem. But the whole point of multiple factors is that you have two strong methods. Just kind of having one sloppy one and having one that you felt more confident about, it kind of doesn't really do the trick. So it was more about providing that therapy when it was appropriate, and also about being good at qualifying opportunities and realizing where you weren't going to be able to change their mind, or you didn't have enough consensus, or there are other objectors within the organization that would be likely to scuttle it before, even if you had a strong sponsor or advocate for the concept.
Yeah, definitely. You see, we work with a lot of technology companies, and we do sometimes see that they kind of forget about that extra step, in the sense that it's like, you don't have to just get the tech company selling to the retailer. It's not, your job isn't only to get them comfortable with your technology. It's also to get them comfortable with the idea that their customers are going to be comfortable with the technology as well, right? And I think sometimes technology companies, especially earlier stage ones, that's another thing they sometimes forget, right? In addition to trying to build it without actually talking enough to the customer, they sometimes build it and not talk to the customer enough. Sometimes they do that, but then they also forget to talk to the end customer to make sure it's working for the people that are actually going to end up using it when it's technology that touches the consumer. So with that, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. This was, really interesting. And, it's fascinating how this is evolving in the marketplace. And I personally love the biometric piece myself, just because it's just one, I don't love integrating all of my passwords into like those password things on my computer. I don't know if that's an irrational fear or not, but this way I don't now have to worry about it. So instead of having to look up, I use a password generator and save it on an app on my phone. Now I don't have to look it up every time, with a bunch of my applications that I use on a regular basis are starting to add those biometrics in. So I find it a lot easier. I love it. I hope that a lot more companies start to use it. But thank you so much for your time. And this was a great conversation. We appreciate it. And, we'll look forward to catching up soon.
Great. Thanks, Max. It was a pleasure. Have a good evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Max. And thank you for joining us. Coresight Research serves our members with cutting-edge research on the intersection of retail and technology, data resources, real-time consumer trends, and consulting services that create global competitive advantage. Visit us at Coresight.com to learn how Coresight Research can support your success. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next week.